Hello and welcome to Erupt, the home for how businesses can scale and transform. Throughout this podcast, we aim to inspire and educate to help you and your business thrive. Across the course of our episodes, we'll be interviewing industry leaders to uncover some of the challenges across the world of work. We aim to give an insight into some of the fastest growing organisations across HR and technology. Please follow us on our journey to erupt and elevate your business. In today's episode, we discuss the topic of being a leader and changing leadership styles throughout the pandemic with Andrew Fox, who is Head of HR, UK and International at VTB Capital.
The subject of my talk today is quite long. Normally when I give presentations to the BTN, I choose an AC/DC song title as the choice for my talk. And this time I was about to do that, then I went on leave and so lost out the ability to do that with Dan. So my unofficial title for today's talk is Skies on Fire. And just because that conjures up such a lovely image for me when I think about the changes that are taking place that we all are facing into. Both scary, but also exciting, but also somewhat beautiful in the nature of that change. So that's why I chose that title. And I'm not going to give you a sort of a bio of myself today, but what I thought I'd do was I would just focus on what I've done over the last 4 years, because in today's age, that can sometimes seem like a lifetime. And I've had a very varied and fortunate 4 years. So I thought I would just touch on some of that as an intro into what I wanted to speak about today. So in 2018 was my last of 10 years with HSBC, so full-time employment in 2018. In 2019, I took some time off, but also started my own consultancy business. And as a consultant, worked in the public sector for a few departments, also did a working assignment over in India, and a couple of other small assignments, which was really quite useful just to make sure that I could still be adept at having my hand in both sort of key large-scale organizational matrix global programs, but also then some more down-to-earth practical day-to-day issues that face both leaders and I think HR professionals on a day-to-day basis. So that was 2019. 2020, of course, pandemic hit, so was at a loss as to what to do. And one of the charities that I work with had a catchphrase for the pandemic. They said, harvest, not hibernate, which I really took on board. I like that. And so I decided in 2020 to do a 1-year executive degree. So that was my 2020. It was fine during the pandemic while I wasn't working, but I had to finish it off this year while I was working. That was a little bit more arduous. And then, of course, I started with VTB in 2021. So if I take a look at the last 4 years, you can see they massively varied. And the reason I thought it's relevant is because I don't think that's unusual, actually. I think the more people I speak to, the more varied you realize their experiences are. And the more you realize that the word normal doesn't really feature into our lives as much as it might have in the past. When I think of leadership and leaders today, I think that the ask of leaders is increasingly onerous, and I think it's going to get more onerous as well. And I think of them as sort of part expert in the technical field in which they're working. They're a part coach because they have to lead and support their teams. They're part wellness therapists because they have to be there for the individuals that they work with if those individuals need them on matters that might not strictly be restricted to work. And then, of course, they have to be part conductor, because in today's modern workplace, you can't just be managing your own small team in isolation, but you exist in a larger whole. And so to be able to manage the relationship between your team and other working parts of the organization and external stakeholders requires, I think, a new set of skills. And so this is why I think the field of leadership and thinking about leadership is so interesting, and certainly has occupied my mind for some time. And so today I'm going to talk about a couple of things I think are relevant for leaders today. I think in the past, organizations typically designed a leadership capability framework and then used that both to assess for hiring and promotion, but also for training against that competency framework for leadership. And in fact, one of the speakers on the other channel this morning, Donald Ross from SAP, spoke exactly about this point, about the fact that we used to develop leaders by building a competency or capability framework and assessing them against that, and then putting some learning in to support them along that journey. But he himself mentioned that probably today that is increasingly difficult because capability frameworks are quite static and often get stale very quickly. And with the pace of change that we have to cope with right now, I actually think it's really difficult. By the time you've developed the capability framework, if you're using those sort of old methodologies to do so, it's already somewhat out of date by the time you launch it. But by the time you're into developing and deploying it, you then have to change it. But I also think it's really interesting to note that not only did we develop these capability frameworks and we started to talk about what leadership really means for us, but a whole industry spread around developing leaders through things like external business schools. And in fact, in 2016, I wrote on LinkedIn and I quoted a McKinsey's figure that said that the sort of leadership development industry was, according to them, a $14 billion industry. And in fact, the article I wrote was provocatively entitled, "Seldom before has so much been spent on so little, and then let the battles begin." Because I really think increasingly business schools are struggling to produce leaders at the end of whatever program they put them through that are genuinely equipped for the challenges of today's workplace. It's not to say they don't have a role to play, but I think they really have to be careful not to become redundant based on the fact that they are building towards a set of capabilities and outcomes on a program that was designed some time ago and will produce leaders into the future. And the real risk for them is that the leaders that they churn out at the end of that process might not be equipped for what's happening today. And it's convenient, but I think it's also lazy to say that we use the pandemic and the way every organization had to pivot when the pandemic hit and lockdown was declared, certainly in most countries. And I say it's lazy because it's just too much of an obvious example. There's lots of other things that are going on in the workplace every day, and the changes that are taking place as time goes by, I think also require from our leaders a significant change from what we asked of them in the past. And so I have not designed, you'll be pleased to know, a new leadership capability framework, so you can breathe a sigh of relief. But I have taken 4 things which I think at the moment are showing that they are really, really important for leaders today. And actually, I don't think any one of them individually is as important as the intersection between all 4 of them is. And that is, the leader has to have the skills that I'm about to talk about, but that's not really enough. In today's challenging environment, they have to be able to link all of them together and present them seamlessly in the way that they operate and engage with all of their stakeholders and not just a few of them. So the first leadership quality I think is becoming increasingly obvious is that the leader needs to be digitally transformed. We'll get on to what I mean by these a little later, but digitally transformed is the first one. The next one I've chosen, but again, I'm going to define it slightly differently to how you might expect, is equity and inclusivity and diversity. I'm then going to talk about self-awareness and self-actualization, and I'm then going to talk about technical competence. So I'm going to focus just on those 4 today, and I'm going to talk about how I've explained them based on my experiences. But as I said, as I do that, bear in mind that I think the real key is on the intersection of these 4 and how they play out in how a leader interacts with their stakeholders or doesn't, as the case might be. And even as I talk about these 4 criteria, for want of a better word, you might say, well, Andrew, they seem very incomplete. And there's a whole lot of capabilities that surely we need from our leaders today, which I haven't touched on. And I think that's true. And I think that's because I think that there's a certain amount of leadership capability that I think in today's age we have to take as a given. In other words, it's the tickets to get on the field to play the game. And if you don't have those, you're not even in the starting blocks, just to mix my sports metaphors there for a moment. So, for example, we might think about, Andrew, where does trust and authenticity fit in? Well, I would say that in today's age, and I think the path here is well trodden, that if you don't have trust and authenticity as a leader, then none of these other things are really going to matter. And so please don't think that my list is meant to be exhaustive. My list is meant to be additive. Now, the first thing I spoke about was digitally transformed. And I think it becomes really clear today that it doesn't matter which organization you work in or what type of team you are leading. If you haven't transformed the way that you think about the world of work in a way that's aligned with digital or technology transformation and change, then you're going to be quickly left behind and your peer group is going to overtake you. But what do I mean by this? This is not about a set of technical skills. In other words, I'm not saying that all leaders now need to be able to code, to use old IT language, or to develop an app to use newer IT language. But what I am saying is that we have to change the way we approach work, which would include working in an agile fashion. And people think that that's restricted to the IT world. And they often, I think, misconstrue what working in an agile fashion means. When I talk about working in an agile fashion, I talk about speed of delivery. I talk about connectivity to key stakeholders. And I talk about frequent check-ins through the development cycle rather than the big reveal at the end. So that's sort of my simplistic way of describing being agile. Another way that I often describe it is being nimble, because then you don't carry the baggage about saying, well, if we're working agile, does that mean we have to have scrums every week? And I say, no, not necessarily. It depends on the nature of your work. So if agile gets you hung up on some of the formal language that is used, then think about being nimble. But think about, I think, more importantly, being connected with all stakeholders that might be involved with the work that you're doing now. And that's not only the obvious stakeholders, perhaps end user or client, but also all those peripheral stakeholders, which we can so easily forget when we're under pressure, but which can play a very important role in whatever work we are doing. However, I think digitally transformed also means that we are now conversant in the world of data. And I think that I've said before that data is the currency of the future. So not techno-currencies, not bitcoins, but data, I think, is going to be the real currency of the future. It's where the real value lies. And so as leaders, I think we have to help our leaders as HR professionals become data and insight led. So obtain data, become conversant in acquiring and using data to build insights upon which you will base decision making. It's no longer sufficient to work on a hunch or to take an instruction in abstract, but rather you need to understand the underlying data. You need to understand the data you need, but you also need to understand the data you will create in the work that you're doing. Use that to build insights and use that to ensure that what you're doing is current, connected to the end user, and still relevant. Linked to that is the way we innovate. It's also linked to the way we deploy creativity. I think it starts to touch on cultural elements, such as there's a lot of dialogue at the moment around to foster creativity, you have to become more tolerant of mistakes. To become tolerant of mistakes, you have to create an environment in which it is safe to make mistakes. So all of those things are tied up in this one thing when I say digitally transformed. So as you can see, I've just taken a simple label, but I've made it really complex in the way that I've defined it. So I'm going to move on now, just mindful of time, to talk about equity, inclusion, and diversity. And I put them in that order deliberately. I know that in years gone by, certainly HR professionals have talked about D&I, diversity and inclusion. We've added the E on now, it seems. And we might be confused about the order. For me, the order is very clear. It's about parity and fairness. It's about including everybody. And it's about having a diverse organization. And when I say diverse, what I really mean is cognitively diverse. So whilst I think that our regulators and other stakeholders might be pushing us to become diverse on elements that we can measure, like gender and ethnicity. And whilst I think those are all important, I think the real prize when it comes to diversity is cognitive diversity. And to get there, though, you have to be inclusive. And to be inclusive, you also have to have an element of fairness. So I think this is increasingly important. And I'm not talking about whether or not you're hitting the targets the regulator has set for you, or whether you've signed up to the 30% club, or whether you've signed up to the millions of other clubs that have arisen in the industry to chase targets and to show that you're making progress on social media. And whilst you may do all of those things, and whilst they may serve a purpose, what I'm really talking about is a leader who has internalized the importance of and the reason for creating a workplace which is completely fair, completely inclusive, and also very diverse cognitively. In other words, if you have a leader that still needs to be convinced, then they're not ready to be a leader in the new world of work as far as I'm concerned. We are now looking for leaders who have internalized this and understand it at its very base level. You don't need to sell to them. You don't need lengthy presentations. You don't need stakeholder dialogue to share with them in order to convince them. And whilst all of those things might be useful as part of your dialogue, actually the leader of the future has to have internalized all of this and not still be in a space where they require convincing. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the leader of the future, I think, has to have a level of self-awareness that leaders that have gone before them may not have found necessary. And I think here, I read a lot about this work from people like Simon Sinek and Francis Frey. And from their work combined, I've created a quote which I think encapsulates what I mean here when I talk about the leader being self-aware. Because I think both Frey and Sinek agree that the role of the leader is in part to help others be better and not be better than others. And I think, not today because we will run out of time, but in your own time, I would urge you just to think about what that statement really means. So the role of the leader is in part to help others be better and not be better than others. And what I'm really talking about here is low ego, high courage. And I think the low ego thing for me is really important. I've spoken a lot in the past about corporate scandals and how they've arisen and the damage that they've caused. And of course, they still go on today. But at the heart of many of them, you find hubris or egos that have ruled the roost and have quashed dissenting voices and have not been able to tolerate views that differ from their own. And I think that's a real shame. I think it's equally dangerous. And I don't think that in the future we have a place for that behavior set amongst our leaders. And so I think that as a leader, I use the language that I think comes from Maslow, but I think also is based in Jungian psychology. We talk about a leader has to be self-actualized. In other words, they have to have undergone in themselves a journey of self-awakening such that they are self-aware not only about how others impact them, but also about their impact on others. They have to be balanced. They have to learn how to manage stress, not only in themselves, but also in those around them. And I think also they have to be continuously curious. And this ties on to my fourth and final criteria. But I honestly think that a leader that's not learning something new on a daily basis, I'm talking about active learning. I'm not just talking about stumbling across facts because you are following through on your Twitter feed. I'm talking about active curiosity, active learning. Then I think, again, you're going to fall behind your peer group. The last criteria that I referenced that I'm going to talk about very quickly is technical competence. I think certainly in my experience historically, we reached a phase that said if you had someone that was a good leader, who would get them to lead a team, even if they didn't understand all the technical elements that made up that team. I've come to modify that view slightly when I think about leaders. And I think that in a world where everyone thinks that their opinion counts equally, and this is what social media has done to us, it says, despite evidence to the contrary, despite facts, I think I'm right. I think the leader, in whatever role he or she finds themselves in, has to have some baseline of technical competence. In other words, let's take HR as an example. I don't think in a modern HR organization you can be an HR leader into the future if you don't have a combination of formal HR education, formal HR experience, as well as a plan in which you are actively managing your ongoing learning and development in this particular field. That does not mean you have to be an expert on every aspect of HR, but it does mean you have to have a baseline of knowledge, and it also means you have to be actively pursuing learning on an ongoing basis. And so I think that applies to every other leadership role. That doesn't mean the leader has to be an expert in every single element of job and work that reports through to him and her, but without a baseline of knowledge and experience, I think organizations have found themselves landing themselves in trouble because the leader didn't spot the problem around the corner. And I think having a baseline of technical competence combined with some of the characteristics that I've just explained around self-awareness, self-actualization, and being courageous enough to admit that you don't know, allows you to see around the corner and to spot problems proactively. Because if you don't, you will lead your team into dark places and into trouble, and ultimately could put your organization at risk. And again, as I said, I think for me, this has been somewhat of a shift, because in the past, I thought, well, if you have the right leadership capability, skill set, then you can lead a group of people, even if you do not understand everything that they're doing. And I've modified that to say, you don't have to understand everything that they're doing, but you have to at least have a baseline of knowledge in terms of the technical work that's being done in the team which you are leading. Because if you don't, I think that represents a real risk. So the last thing I will say before I hand back to Magnus and we'll see if there are any questions, and hopefully there are some. But the last thing I would say is that when we look at leadership, I think one of the most important things is context. So when we look at leadership, there's no one book, there's no one model, there's no one set of capabilities that you can take off the shelf. When I think about leadership, I'm drawing upon the work of at least 5 or 6 different thought leaders at any one point in time. And then I'm still modifying it for context, i.e., the leader that you need depends on the organization that you're in and where that organization is in its own level of maturity and in its own journey. And of course, a top leader in one organization doesn't mean that that leader will transplant well into another organization. They may if they're adaptable enough, but it's not a given any longer, because part of a leader's success is bound in context. And it's how easily and readily they adapt to the organization and the industry and the culture that they're in that really will determine whether or not they can be successful. And so considering leadership capabilities, leadership frameworks, leadership assessments, leadership skill sets in abstract of context, I think is literally a waste of time, because I don't think it will carry meaning if you're looking to future-proof your organization and if you're looking to create leaders that will build a sustainable organization for you in the future.
So we have a couple of questions here. So I'll start off with a fantastic question, Andrew, which is, does agile for business mean agility within business? Should we drive a holistic view of people, their skills and business objectives in an agnostic way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I don't fully understand in the agnostic way, but I'll answer the question in the best way I understand it. I think when we talk about agility, as I said, sometimes I talk about nimbleness to get away from the baggage that agile carries with it, because the agile is a formal methodology. And by the way, I think that all HR leaders and all leaders everywhere should be aware of what that methodology is. That means read a book, go on a course, watch a YouTube video, however you learn, but you should understand the bare basics of agility. And I do think that organizations now need to become agile as part of their DNA. In other words, they need to change the way that they work, both internally amongst themselves, that is more connected with themselves and doing work in cross-functional teams rather than in silos. And I also think that means that they have to become more agile in the way they engage with their external stakeholders. And I include the client or the customer or the end user in that, but I don't only include the end user or client in that. I include all external stakeholders. So for example, if you're a listed company, the way you engage with your shareholders needs to shift and change with the times and needs to be more agile. In other words, you need to have more frequent touch points with them. You need to gather views on a more regular basis. You need to feed those views back into the organization. You need to make sure the organization is responding to those views if they are shareholders. If they're customers, the same applies, and hopefully all organizations are already doing that. Only when you are tapped in that nimble manner can you pivot and respond. And I think, Magnus, the simplistic example I would give, and it is a bit of a lazy one, as I said before, because it uses COVID, but you saw what happened to restaurants during COVID. So when lockdown happens, most restaurants, at least the seating part of restaurants, had to close. Bang! It was almost overnight. They literally closed their doors with produce on their shelves that was either sold, given to staff, or given away or left to spoil. But you saw something interesting emerge as time went by. You saw some restaurants changing their model and focusing either on charitable endeavors or on a takeaway, for example. Now, not every restaurant lends itself to that, but even some restaurants that you would never have thought, some sort of, shall I say, fancier, sort of Michelin star-orientated restaurants started to pivot towards a takeaway because they didn't want to lie dormant and they had real estate that was sitting there costing them money. And I think this ability to turn on a dime, to use an old expression, is really, really important. You can't do it with your external stakeholders and externally with your market if you're not that way internally, because you get stuck in bureaucracy, you get stuck in silos that don't want to cooperate with each other. And I think it starts internally, breaking down those silos, getting work done in cross-functional teams, adopting a more agile or nimble methodology in terms of the way you produce any work. It doesn't matter what the project is, but change the way it's done. The days of a 6-month project with a big reveal at the end are long gone, I think. Now it's about frequent touch points with stakeholders to make sure that you're staying current and on point. So I think that's the best version of your answer, Magnus. I can muster.
Brilliant. It was a great answer. And the next question, Andrew, is there a different leader mosaic for organizations who aren't necessarily embracing the work from home piece that was obviously kind of forced upon us in the first instance, but obviously now people are kind of utilizing that and are certainly seeing the value add. Is there a different leader mosaic needed for those organizations that aren't necessarily embracing the working from home bit?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there's a different set of leadership skills required in the new world of work, because the new world of work has an element of remoteness to it, whether the organization has adopted that yet or not. So that would be my first point. Some organizations have always had some flexibility. Some didn't have flexibility pre-pandemic and have now introduced it, and my organization is one of those. And other organizations didn't have remote working flexibility before the pandemic, had it during the pandemic by necessity, and have returned to a full-time back in work model now. So I think it doesn't matter what model you've adopted post-pandemic, but you do require a different set of leadership skills, because to manage a team that's mixed between remote and physically present is different to that set of skills where your team is all present. Now, does that mean that organizations who have come back and insisted everybody return to work on a full-time basis are, in some way wrong? No, they've just made a choice. They obviously feel for them that choice is correct. It'll either work for them, and then not only will they carry on with that, but they'll have other people that will emanate, or it will not work for them, and you'll see them change over time. And that depends on how responsive they are to what's going on around them. At the moment, I think pre-pandemic, remote working wasn't a competitive issue. So in other words, when you were recruiting talent, remote working was seldom a question that was asked. All of my recruitment from June this year, every interview, irrespective of level, irrespective of comp, the question has come up. And so I think what you're going to find is that people increasingly now view this as part of the way of working going forwards. And by the way, I don't subscribe to the view that says all work can be done remotely and anyone who's not doing that is just needing to catch up. I actually think the hybrid model of part remote, part physically present in the workplace is the right model. I think we forget the reason we pivoted overnight so successfully to a work from home model in the pandemic was because we had existing relationships that had been built up over time and had high levels of trust. There are some things that can easily be done remotely, but there are other things that are best done in a face-to-face environment. The clever organizations are going to work out which is which. The clever leaders are going to work out which is which. The clever leaders will tell their teams when they can be at home, and they will also know when to bring their teams into the workplace. And that, I think, is a new emerging skill of the leader. Because if you don't have that skill, you're going to be binary. Okay, you can be at home all the time. Okay, you have to be in the office all the time. That's just easy. And I think that's also a bit lazy. I think the real complexity lies in, no, we can have a hybrid model, and I will help you decide when it's best that you work from home and then when it's best that you work from the office. And that's a new emerging skill that I think the asker of the question should focus on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew.
Take care.
This podcast was brought to you by Annapurna Erupt. If you enjoyed this episode, please visit our Go Erupt website to get involved in our regular podcasts, video footage, and live events throughout the year. Thank you for listening.